Welcome back to our study of women in the Bible here at Holy Family Catholic Church. It's been a fascinating study, but we're going to start picking up the pace now. We spent the first entire class speaking about one woman, Eve, because of course she's been blamed for all sin and evil in the world. She deserved a class of her own for us to vindicate her. Last class together we discussed Sarah and Rebecca, the wives of Abraham and Isaac. Tonight we'll come to Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah, who were the two wives and two concubines of Jacob. After that, we'll talk about Tamar and her relationship with Judah, Zelicah, and Asnet, who are both related to the story of Joseph, all in the book of Genesis, and that will bring together all the women of the book of Genesis. Ready to jump in? We start this evening then with Jacob and his wives and concubines. Like Abraham, Isaac was convinced that his son shouldn't marry a Canaanite, but should instead marry a relative. In the scripture, we all have all sorts of family wreaths, right? Where we have people who are intermarrying in the same family. You're going to see the same here. Jesus said, the same measure with which you measure will be measured back to you. It's only just that the conniving Jacob should fall victim to another conniver, his future father-in-law, Laban. Do you remember the story of Jacob? How is Jacob a conniver? Remember that story from last time? Jacob's mother, Rebecca, wanted her youngest son to receive the blessing, which was not the custom. The oldest son got the blessing. The oldest son was all hairy. The father was blind. So what did she do? She dressed her younger son up with goat skin so that her father would feel his hairy arms and think it's the older brother and give him the blessing, which he did. Jacob was a conniver, fooled his father. Now it's only right that Laban should be, that Jacob should find himself connived as well. Perhaps you've heard this story. Jacob worked for Laban for 7 years to earn Laban's younger daughter, Rachel. So Jacob was interested not in Leah, but in Rachel. The challenge was that Rachel was younger, Leah was older, so Laban was more interested in marrying off his older daughter than his younger daughter. Any of us getting married wearing a wedding veil? The wedding veil that we have today is like usually something that you can see through. The wedding veil in the ancient world was nothing that you could see through, which meant that in a time of arranged marriages, you had no idea who you were getting until, right? And so the story is told, and of course these stories were not written down until hundreds and hundreds of years later, but the story is told that Jacob married his wife Leah, went back that evening, lay with her, they had sex together, they had a child, wake up the next morning and found out that he married and had relations not with Rachel that he was hoping to marry, but with Leah. What made it worse was that Jacob's agreement was that he would work for 7 years to be able to earn that man's daughter, to earn Laban's daughter. Worked for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, rather than getting the daughter that he wanted, he got the daughter that he got. So far, so good?
Yikes.
Yikes is right. So, Jacob was still in love with Rachel, wanted to marry Rachel, so said, hey, how's this for a deal? I'll work with you for another 7 years if you promise to give me your daughter Rachel in marriage. So, he worked for another 7 years, got the daughter Rachel in marriage. Ready for Jacob's sons? We know Jacob by another name. What's Jacob's other name? So let's put their husbands beside them here. Eve's husband is Adam. Sarah's husband was Abraham. Rebecca's husband was Isaac. And Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah all go together with Jacob, whose other name was Israel. So when we talk about the tribes of Israel, we're talking about all the people who descended from Jacob. It was our etiological explanation. It was our way of explaining how it is that we're so like our neighbors, neighboring tribes. We're like them, but we're different. That's because, according to the story that we told, we all descend from the same ancestor. We have a common ancestor in Jacob, or Israel. So we talked about the 12 tribes of Israel. Number 3, the fancy word that we see here is sororal polygyny. Let's just review some of the words that we had last time. What is polygamy? Polygamy is having more than one spouse. If you have more than one spouse, then you're a polygamist. If you have more than one husband, women, then you're a polyandrist. But if you have more than, guys, if you have more than one wife, then you are a polygynist. So sororal polygyny means that you're marrying 2 people who are sisters. Oh, what did Jacob end up doing? Married 2 women who were sisters. First instance of biblical sororal polygyny. The daughters, this is a play in Hebrew. For those who don't speak Hebrew, we wouldn't catch them necessarily, but the daughters, Benot of Lavan, became the Banot, the builders of Israel. Leah and Jacob become the 2 beams running from one end of the world to the other. Of these 4 women, all of Jacob's going to have his children, all the 12 tribes of Israel, with these 4 women. After the bridal week, then, Jacob was allowed to marry the younger sister, Rachel, in return for another 7 years of labor. Another instance of matrilocal marriage. What does that mean? When he gets married, who's going to be living with his family? No, with her family. Matrilocal marriage. Matrilocal marriage was problematic for men, though, because had war broken out between Jacob and Laban, who was their father, whose side would he fight for? Would he fight for her side of the family? Or would he fight for his side of the family? Which is why you can see the rise in patriarchy and the rise of patrilineal marriage. Laban represented remnants of matrilocal marriage and growing patrilineal kinship. In plain English, what we see happening here is Jacob is living with his wife's family, but who is the head of the household? Was it their mother? No, it was their father, Laban. So it's a patrilineal kinship in a matrilocal marriage. Do you remember last time when we talked about sex-bearing wives and about childbearing wives and sex-object wives? How it was that when you have polygamy, more than one wife, then suddenly men found themselves with more than one type of wife. We refer to them as the childbearing wife or wives and the sex-object wife or wives. Here in this instance, we see that Leah is the one bearing the children for Jacob, and Rachel, being the younger one, the one that he loved, was obviously not the childbearing wife in that relationship. Leah gives birth to 3 sons, thinking, oh, if I just give birth to another son, think patriarchal society, the value of sons over daughters. She gives birth to 3 sons, thinking, oh, maybe he will love me like he loves Rachel now that I've given him 3 sons. Did it work? No. Gives him another 3 sons, letter B. Another 3 sons. Oh, now he'll love me. I've given him 6 sons. Did he love her anymore now? No. Let's see. Letter D, like her mother-in-law who had suicidal thoughts, Rachel cried to Jacob, give me children or I'll die. Rachel now, stepping up, wanting to have Jacob's child. Her sister now has 6 kids with Jacob. Rachel now desiring a child with Jacob. But before we get to Jacob's child with Rachel, Rachel offers her slave and half-sister Bilhah. Let's unpack this now. Her slave and half-sister. Her half-sister means that her father was her father and the father of her slave girl. And so when she got married, it was her and her slave girl who are now in this, you take your slave girl with you. So the next one to have a child is going to be Bilhah, which is letter D. If you're counting, Jacob now has 6 sons. Jacob then has 2 sons through his concubine Bilhah, and then 2 sons through his concubine Zilpah, who was Leah's slave. So now that's 10 sons. Letter F, Leah then gives birth to 2 more sons and a daughter, Dinah, and that's 13 kids for Jacob, 12 boys and their baby sister Dinah. Finally, God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant, gave birth to a son, and who is Rachel's son? Rachel's son is going to be Joseph, who's going to be the star of this part of the story. Joseph, not to be confused with the husband of Mary. This is the Joseph in the Old Testament from the book of Genesis.
Men don't come out looking too good here.
Or anywhere else.
There you
Didn't
go.
say that.
Ooh. Touche.
So yeah, so it was obviously a different society. So what we recognize in the 21st century is how new, how recent, how innovative monogamy is. The human being, the human person has not always been monogamous, has not always entered into a relationship with one person. This is a recent innovation in the history of the human species. Number 5, are you ready for a story of shrunken head idols? Shrunken head idols. I couldn't make this up. On page 8, letter A. Before the story of the birth of Rachel's second son, so Rachel's now giving birth to one son, Joseph, we're going to press the pause button here and tell a few other stories. One of them is about how it is that we have an interlude where Rachel is stealing her father Laban's teraphim. So the question becomes, what are teraphim? Teraphim are idols of household gods. So in the ancient world, we have this idea of them fashioning idols that they worship. You find them in Genesis 31:19. When her father Laban tells Jacob that someone stole his gods, he didn't know who stole his gods. Who stole his gods, his idols? Rachel. Jacob didn't know this, so Jacob tells his father-in-law, if you find anyone who has your gods, your idols, that person shall not live. Right? So, what were the teraphim? How were they made? The teraphim were frequently made from the shrunken heads of firstborn sons who had been sacrificed. The hair was removed, the head was salted and oiled, and a small tablet of copper or gold with the name written on it was placed under the tongue. The worshiper or the diviner would then light candles and bow down to it. The head would respond to questions. It was used for answering questions. If you have a question, instead of going to Father Jamie, you just light the candle and go to your teraphim, your household idol. It's quite an image. Jacob's later burying of the idols, though, in Genesis chapter 35, shows the Jewish ideal of the abandonment of such pagan rituals. One of the reasons we told these stories was to let people know it is not cool to have idols. The fascinating thing is that our Jewish sisters and brothers would wonder if Catholics don't continue to use idols or images of sorts. Come back to that. Any questions or comments on Rachel stealing the teraphim, her father's idols? If not, remember who Dinah was? Avenging Dinah. Dinah's right. Dinah, remember when they had these, the count was, before Joseph, the count was 12 sons and a daughter. There's a daughter in the mix there. What was the daughter's name? Dinah. You also have the story of Jacob dislocating his hip as a result of wrestling with God. Maybe you've heard that story before, Genesis 31. And of Jacob avenging the rape of his daughter Dinah. She was raped by a man named Shechem, who was the son of the prince. You may have heard the story of how he killed them. Remember, Abraham had this idea that Abraham's God told him that he needed to be circumcised, that he needed to cut off the foreskin, his foreskin, a sign of the defeated in battle. So Jacob is telling Shechem and his army that they all need to get circumcised, and while they're recovering from that wound, each one of the men, Jacob takes advantage of the moment to kill them all. story of male dominance and female seclusion. Genesis 34, 28-29 says, quote, "They seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in the houses. And as part of that, they raped Jacob's daughter, Dinah." We remember it mostly because of the story that is told in Judges, the book of Judges, chapter 9, verse 2, which is not contained in all Bibles. You won't find it in a Protestant Bible. In the Catholic Bible, we have a book called the Book of Judges, and in that book of Judges, it talks about how it was that when they came in and destroyed the temple, we likened it, we compared it to the rape of Dinah. The enemies coming in and plundering our temple, ruining our temple, was like Shechem's ruining of Dinah. But Dinah was villainized, says letter 7, in a patriarchal society. The men are always the heroes, the women are always blamed. Dinah was blamed for her own rape, as sad as that is, because she went out to see the daughters of the land, Genesis 34:1. Her story was used to suppress and seclude women. No, Becky, you cannot go outside. Remember what happened with Dinah. Right? A way of men controlling women. We're just going to pause there because that's as good a place as any for us to, if there are any questions or comments on all of these. It ended up then that Rachel, when she gave birth to her second son, Benjamin, who's not listed, Benjamin, her youngest son, in childbirth, she died. She died in childbirth.
What is the word deuterocanonical?
Deuterocanonical are those books that we have in our Catholic Bible that non-Catholics do not have in theirs. So we've decided over the years to add some books to our Bible. The Deuterocanonical Bible, the Apocrypha, we sometimes call it, are those books. So Judges is one of the Deuterocanonical books.
Good.
Ready for a fascinating story of Jesus' ancestor? So Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, when it talks about all of his ancestors, it's all men, as if men could give birth without women, right? And then this man is the son of this man, and this man is the son of this man. It just keeps tracing back all of the men. But there are a few instances, four women who make it into Jesus' genealogy. Mary, of course, is one of those four. So the question becomes, who are those other three women? In tracing all these men back, this was the son of him, and he was the son of him, and he was the son of him, and tracing them back and back and back. There's one woman who's mentioned, and she is Tamar. Ready for the story of Tamar? After speaking briefly of Joseph, so now we've moved on to the story of Joseph, and we talk about how Joseph had this magnificently colored coat. Have you heard that story before? It turned into a Broadway musical, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. All of his brothers were envious because of this colorful coat that his father Jacob gave to him, like he's so special. They ended up throwing him in a well. A caravan comes by. They sell him off. So Joseph goes into Egypt, and they take his tunic, dip it into blood, and tell his father, we found his tunic, and it's covered with blood. So of course, what did his father think? That Joseph was dead. Instead, Joseph was off in Egypt. But before we pick up the story of Joseph in the Bible, what happens is the Bible gives us sort of like that prelude of Joseph and the envious brothers and being sent off to Egypt, and then presses the pause button to tell us the story of Tamar before coming back to the Joseph story. Ready for the story of Tamar? Number one. Actually, number one just tells us that Tamar is an ancestress of Jesus, meaning she's going to be one of Jesus' great grandmothers way back down the line. The tribe of Judah occupied the future land containing Israel. So we talked about the 12 tribes of Israel. So all of these children of Israel, all of these children by all these women, it was our way of explaining how it is that here we are, we're one of, we have all sorts of neighbors. Some of them are smaller than others, but there are all sorts of people living throughout the Near East, the Middle East. And so if we're here, this is us, and these are our neighbors. The way that we explained it was, how are we like them, but they're also different from us. Did you ever notice that? People from the United States are kind of like Mexicans and Canadians, but there are some differences in how we talk and things that we believe, etc. Same back in the ancient world. The way that they explained it was, well, that's because all of us descend from the same folks. We said that we all traced ourselves back to Jacob, or to Israel. We were the 12 tribes of Israel. Do you remember where the capital was when David became the king? Where did David take his capital? David took his capital up to the city of, we built the temple there.
Jerusalem.
So the question arises, which tribe, which land was Jerusalem located in? Jerusalem, the capital city, was in the land of Judah. Meaning, as we go into the names of the different tribes, the tribe of Judah was the ones near the southern capital of Jerusalem. So the story that we're going to tell here concerns Tamar and Judah. Because if the Messiah, if there is going to be a Messiah, is the Messiah going to come from this tiny little tribe up here in the north? No. The Messiah is going to descend from the most, from the most important tribe. What was the most important tribe? Judah. Where did Micah say that the Messiah would be born? You Bethlehem of Judah. Where was Jesus born? Jesus, according to the stories, was born in Bethlehem of Judah. So even though he was from the north, we had to figure out in our story how to get him to the south. What was the way that we got him to the south? Why did Jesus' parents travel to the south? Census. So they went from their place in the south up in the north in Galilee, all the way down to the south to their hometown of Bethlehem in Judah to be registered for the census. So far so good. So that's the land of Judah, where the capital city is. So the question now becomes, who is this Judah that it was named after? Isaac was the son of Abraham. Jacob was the son of Isaac. So that's his grandpa. Judah and Joseph were both sons of Jacob. So we're going to press the pause button on Joseph to talk about Judah for a moment. Number 2, the tribe of Judah occupied the future land containing Jerusalem. Number 3, the book of Micah, the prophet Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. If you want to flip open your Bible, it talks about how the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem of Judah. Number 4, so Judah married a nameless woman from Canaan, a Canaanite woman. We don't know her name, no one wrote it down. But she gave birth to 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Judah secured Tamar as the wife of his firstborn, So Judah has 3 sons. 1, 2, and 3. The oldest son is He married Tamar. Have you heard stories in the Bible, like where Jesus is talking? Oh, and so a woman married a man, but then he died. So what did the woman do? The woman married her brother. And it just keeps going on and on and on. Have you heard stories like that before? So in the ancient world, when you were a woman, as odd as this sounds to us in the 21st century, you didn't marry a man, you married a tribe. You married a family. And the challenge was that when you, I don't know how to say this in any way that doesn't sound crass, but if you're married to various brothers, and now you don't know whose child you're bearing, is that, you know? If you don't know whose child you're bearing, you as the mother get to decide which father is credited for that child, or we'll just assign them in rotation. We'll give the older brother credit for the first son, and the second brother credit for the second child, the third brother credit for the third child. And we'll either rotate, or you know better than I whose it might be.
Go for the money.
Joseph.
I didn't say that.
So, and Tamar are now married, except that dies. If dies, what's going to happen to Tamar? Then now she's going to be considered married to the second son. In this case, the second son is number 8, Onan. So now it's Onan and Tamar. In an age when we were trying to teach lessons to our little boys and little girls obviously got the lesson, don't go outside. You heard what happened to Dinah. Boys got the message of what happened to Onan. The question becomes, what happened to Onan? Number 8, Onan, now that he's married to Tamar, Onan wasn't necessarily interested in having kids, and so Onan, the technical term they use for it is coitus interruptus, Onan pulled out. So, read the Bible yourselves. Onan spilled his seed, and as a result of that, God got angry and struck him down. And so while we were teaching our girls, Becky, don't go outside. You heard what happened to Dinah. Same way we tell our little boys, Joey, is it okay, right? Joe, don't go outside.
That's what I was told.
Joe, don't go spilling your seed. This is the 21st century now. We recognize a few things about modern day science. One of those things is that we know that the male body produces sperm, and it does that throughout its entire life. Unlike women who experience menopause, men continue to produce sperm throughout life, which is why the Guinness Book of World Records has the oldest father at age 96. Dang.
She didn't.
So, the human body produces sperm. It's going to get rid of that sperm in 2 ways, either through nocturnal emissions, wet dreams, or through the spilling of seed. So obviously in the 21st century we have different views on the sinfulness or lack thereof of these sorts of things, but in the ancient world it was something that we wanted to enforce the notion that thou shalt not do certain things. So Onan was struck down because of spilling a seed. Okay, you're Judah, or his wife. You're the father and mother of the family. Tamar has married your oldest son, he died. Tamar has married your second son, he died. How quick are you going to be to have Tamar marry your third son? She's a little unlucky. Follow me? Number 9, Judah told Tamar to wait until his third son, Shelah, was old enough to marry. If he wasn't old enough to marry, that means he wasn't 12 years old yet. When you were 12 years old, you were old enough to marry in the ancient world. Okay? Judah didn't want to give his son to a Katlanit like Tamar, to a woman who seemingly caused 2 husbands to die. Poor Tamar. What option does she have? Because she's already married the family. Follow me? She's married the family, but now she ain't got a husband. So she doesn't have any options. She's affiliated with that family. You can't marry outside. You can't marry outside the family. You're married to the family. Number 10. Thinking that her father-in-law Judah had tricked her, Tamar plotted Ibum, levirate marriage, with her father-in-law. Well, if he's not going to give me his son, I am going to get him. Number 11. One day, Judah, this is Judah now, traveled to Timnah for the sheep shearing festival. When Tamar heard about this, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, he was old enough to be married to her, she had not been given to him as his wife. Let's just pause and see if there are any questions so far, because we're reading from the Bible now. We'll continue. When Judah saw Tamar, though she was disguised in a veil, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." And she asked, "What will you give me to sleep with you?" He said, "I'll send you a young goat from my flock." She said, "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" "I'll give you a goat from my flock." No, I want something now. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" She said, "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand. You give me the staff, and when you send me the goat, I'll send your staff back to the people who brought me the goat." So far, so good? Does Judah know that he's with Tamar? No. Who does he think he's with? He thinks he's with a prostitute. So he gave them to her, and he slept with her. Judah slept with his daughter-in-law, and she became pregnant by Judah, by her father-in-law. After she left, she took off her veil, put on her widow's clothes again. So a few things are happening here. Number 12. Judah has committed idolatry by having intercourse, sex with a shrine prostitute, who he thought was a shrine prostitute. Follow me? She disappeared with his seal, cord, and staff. He sent a friend to search for her, asking, "Where's that prostitute who was beside the road?" Right? "I'm going to get my master's staff back. Here's the goat." They said, "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." This is all from the Bible, Genesis 38:21. 3 months later, Tamar shows up and she's pregnant. We know that she's pregnant with her father-in-law Judah's child, but he doesn't know it. So he's enraged that this woman who is supposed to be married to his family is pregnant, and it's not by his son. Follow me? He is not happy. He orders her execution thing. "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns," ready for the reveal, "this staff."
Oh my gosh.
Whoa!
Da, da, da.
This would be a good scene in the movie, huh?
Really?
"You're pregnant. We will kill you." She's like, "Yes, and I'm pregnant by the guy who owns." Oh, look at this. Anyone recognize this staff?
I lost it.
Number 14. She used his own words against him. Judah had previously presented Joseph's amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat to his father, saying to Jacob, see, this is interesting. Talk about connivers, being connived. Judah was the one who took the blood drip coat back to his father Jacob and said, "Oh, look at this. We don't know what happened to Joseph, but we found his tunic all covered with blood." Now we have Tamar getting back at him, saying, using the same words when he went to his father and said, "Oh, identify this cloak. This is your son's cloak, right?" Tamar's using the same words against him now. "Oh, identify this staff. Whose staff is this?" Uh-oh. Judah recognized, quote, "She is more righteous than I, since I would not give her to my son." He recognized that he was wrong in not giving his son Shelah to her. So not only did Tamar avoid death in this instance, but she gave birth to Judah's twin sons. Fascinating story if you want to read that one. When they had twins in the ancient world, they had to figure out how to figure out which one was which. So they tied a cord around the wrist of the first hand that came out of the womb. The first hand pushed it out of the womb. They're like, oh, quick, grab the thread. They put the piece of thread on it, and then the hand disappeared. And then the other baby came out of the womb first, because they thought that they were tagging the first one to come out. And so there are all sorts of stories. We're going to read a fascinating story in the Bible of that fascinating birth. You'll find it in Genesis chapter 38. But what's fascinating for our sake is that when Jesus is traced back ancestor to ancestor, Jesus is the son of Joseph, Joseph is the son of this person, they keep tracing back and back and back. They trace them all the way back to Judah and Tamar. The reason that we have these three women with irregular situations in Jesus' genealogy is to prepare us so that when we get to Mary, suddenly Mary's situation is not so hard to believe, because we've heard some pretty incredible stories. Have you heard the story of Tamar? Let me tell you the story of Tamar. What a crazy story that was. And yet, Jesus descended from her. Follow me? Her trickery, if we call it that, her relationship with Judah, resulted later in the Messiah. God can work through these things. The crazy drama in our lives. So Tamar not only avoided death, but she gave birth to sons. And what fascinates us is that whereas other women are blamed in the scriptures, people like Eve are blamed. But here we find nothing but praise for Tamar for her righteousness. We're just going to pause and see what questions, comments, words of shock.
Unbelievable.
I feel like I want to see that movie now.
Is there a movie on this day?
Right? There'd be a great reveal. It'd be like, oh, who got me pregnant? I'll tell you who got me pregnant. It was the person who owned this thing. Oh, my.
13 here has me bothered.
Yes.
So he orders her execution.
Huh?
Bring her out and have her burned to death.
Yeah.
I mean, that's cold-blooded.
Yeah, because she belongs to his family. And he knows that he did not give his third son, Shelah, to her. So if she is pregnant and is not by Shelah, then that's not right.
Damn.
How can you be pregnant? Because I know that my son has not had relations with you.
Put her on the bus, don't
And send her away.
Should have asked her, you weren't by chance like dressed up on the side of the road a few months ago, were you? Ready for the story of Joseph now? And this will bring us to the end of the book of Genesis. In Joseph, we're going to find the women Zuleika. Zuleika, we know her as Potiphar's wife. We'll get to that in just a moment. And then Joseph's going to marry Asnet, and we'll talk about her as well. So before we press pause for the story of Tamar, we were talking about Joseph's story. Joseph had all these brothers. He had this amazing coat that his father gave him. They were all jealous, threw him into a pit, sent him off to Egypt. Press the pause button, tell this story, because what's going to happen is this story is going to be the contrast for this story. In the first story, Judah gave in to temptation. In the second story, Joseph, virtuous man that he is going to resist. Joseph, Zuleika, and Asnet. First of all, just a note, what's interesting about this is that God appears to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God never appears to Joseph. It's interesting that whoever wrote these stories didn't give us any indication of God coming to Joseph in the same way that God came to those other patriarchs of the faith. Number 2, Joseph now is going to become the opposite of Judah. Judah gave in to temptation, but Joseph will refuse to have sex with his master's wife. Have sex with his master's wife. Actually, that was expected in part. So that brings us to number 3, which is this phenomenon in the ancient world of what we called hospitality prostitution.
Whoa.
Which simply meant that when you went over to your friend's house, your friend said, hey, welcome, glad to have you here.
Help yourself.
Here's my wife, here's my daughter, here's my slave girl. Yeah. You shared what you had. So there was, and not only was it, so a man being able to enjoy another woman's presence, whichever woman or was being offered to him, but there was some expectation of mutual satisfaction here, of him being pleased, but also of him pleasing. Number 4, there was a mutual expectation. The wife or the concubine or the daughter had to satisfy the guest, but the guest had to satisfy her. If he failed to satisfy her, she tore his garment, and he was shamed and chased away. Yikes. Have you heard, I put here a note on Ash Wednesday. We still talk about these symbols of pouring ashes on your head or of tearing your garments. That comes from the whole shaming. It was shameful to go in public with torn clothing. Now it's fashionable to have jeans with all sorts of rips in them.
Yeah.
But back then, you didn't wear torn clothing.
Shameful.
And so now Joseph, number 5, found himself in Egypt. He was sold by the Ishmaelites, the caravan that came, to the captain of the guard. And Joseph's master Potiphar put him in charge of his household. Now Potiphar, the tradition suggests, was a eunuch because Potiphar was the head of the Pharaoh's harem. So let's break this down here. Here's Pharaoh. Pharaoh had a harem. So that's Pharaoh's women. The people who guarded the harem could not be
Tempted.
men that could be tempted. Thank you for the words. And so the way to ensure that they would not be tempted would be to only allow eunuchs near them. So one of these eunuchs was Potiphar. So Potiphar's wife, Zuleika, found herself married to a eunuch who took care of Pharaoh's harem. So far so good? So now when the handsome Joseph comes on the scene, wink, wink, then Zuleika, whose husband is a eunuch, is thinking, he's really handsome. Number 7, or let's back up to number 6. Married to a eunuch, Potiphar's wife tried to lure to bed the well-built and handsome Joseph, Genesis 39:6. Joseph refused to go to bed with her, or to even be with her, Genesis 39:10. The story continues. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house, Genesis 39:12. Potiphar's wife screamed and blamed Joseph, suggesting that he had made an advance on her. Oh, that could be dangerous. Except that Potiphar did not believe him. The reason we know this is because Joseph lived. Had Joseph tried to take advantage of his wife, Potiphar would have dealt with it. But instead, that's why we go up to this phrase in number 3 of hospitality prostitution. What's mine is yours. Number 8, relaxing her chastity. Potiphar's wife exposes the structure of prostitution hospitality. Potiphar opens his entire house and his supervision to the outsider's pleasure, to Joseph's pleasure, while his wife offers him her sexuality. In the Jewish tradition, Potiphar's wife had a name, and that was Zuleika. Interestingly, now in the 21st century, we read this story in a different way, because in the 21st century, even feminist writers are reading it as a story of sexual abuse of this woman who's trying to force this person into a relationship, and when he refuses, she gets him punished. He goes off to jail as a result of her accusations. But as a result, if you look up on Wikipedia, there are epic love stories, love poems, love songs of Joseph and Zuleika, that talk about that incident. Needless to say, Joseph goes off to prison. As a reward for interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph is given a white ass net, Genesis 41:45, and they eclipse Osiris and Isis in Egypt, who were Egyptian gods, an Egyptian god and goddess. They're both depicted as Osiris, the man, is depicted as a cornstalk. Isis, the goddess, is depicted as a field of corn. Osiris is a bull, Isis is a cow. Interestingly, what was Pharaoh's dream all about? It was about cows and corn. And so that, in a nutshell, is the women of the book of Genesis, with all the fascinating side notes that we had into all sorts of things that we learned that we haven't learned in other Bible study classes about concubines and harems and all sorts of things that we're opening our eyes to.
Is there a reason why we don't hear some, I mean, I get why we don't hear all of them, but is there a reason why we don't read some of these on Sundays? Why they're not part of the, the readings?
That is an excellent question. I mean, it seems that there are stories for it. I mean, essentially, the church asks, what lessons would it like people to learn on any given Sunday, and how can we draw those lessons together as similar lessons? I mean, it seems it's simply the task of figuring out, if we were to reclaim that, what are some of the lessons that we might take out of some of these stories? Right? Of the righteousness or faithfulness of Tamar, or the faithlessness, or the actions of Judah. The virtue of Joseph. I have a feeling part of the answer this comes to the fact that as Christians we know less about the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and we know a lot more about the New Testament. And so, for instance, in the course of the year, if we only have 52 Sundays, that means we can only take 52 small pieces of the Old Testament in any given year. Which 52 are we going to take? Mario?
There's a part in the Bible about eunuchs. It says some were born like this, and some are made like this. And I don't know whether I used to take all these literature courses, and they claim that at one time they would castrate the child so he could keep singing
Because
in the tone, a high pitch.
Yeah.
And that used to happen, but I don't know where it's still going on, but.
It's the 21st century. I don't know either. I haven't heard any stories, but certainly in the history of the church, there's a long history of eunuchs, back in the time of the scriptures. More recently into the castrati.
I mean, stories, but there were priests that the high priest would say that child needs to be castrated so he could continue with the choir.
Right?
Ooh, it's horrible.
I've heard everything, but I've never heard that one.
You never, it's, it's Kandi, Kandi, book of Candide, you know, where he goes through the world and all that, he comes back and he meets people like that. I mean, went to a sanctuary and, yeah, where priests were in charge. He learned about that. He took off.
I have a feeling if nothing else, maybe this course of study gives us a few, what do you call it, a few roads that we can walk down if we're interested in exploring anything. A lot of these stories are told in our podcast, Extraordinary Catholics podcast. So if you find yourself driving to work with a few extra minutes, if you do podcasts, find your podcast app, look up Extraordinary Catholics podcast, all sorts of fascinating stories. All these stories that we're telling here is nothing that we're hearing for the first time in this class. I've told all these same stories on the podcast.
As far as women.
You know, I'm the only person in this room that actually drove a team and worked on a farm. I don't know what podcast means.
It's like radio on demand. You can find my podcast, my lessons on a smartphone.
What's a smartphone?
Thing under your
Shall
head.
we conclude the prayer? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, a world without end. Amen. We'll be back next week.